Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into a world where every street corner has eyes, every whisper carries weight, and every move you make is quietly judged. This is life in a Japanese castle town, a place that may look peaceful from a distance, but where obedience isn't just expected, it's a matter of survival. At the very center rises the Lord's towering fortress, a shadow that stretches over the homes, the markets, and the narrow winding streets below. These roads aren't designed for comfort. They're traps for invaders, mazes for strangers, and constant reminders that you're walking under the watch of the castle. Samurai patrols pass silently, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, while merchants bow low, careful not to speak too loudly or appear too ambitious. Every interaction, every festival, every law is shaped to keep order, and order always favors the Lord. Punishments are public, curfews are strict, and spies are never far away. In this town, the wrong word, the wrong gesture, even the wrong color of clothing could be the last mistake you ever make. So settle in, and let's take a walk through the castle gates. The castle rose above everything, a layered silhouette of white plaster walls, black-tiled roofs, and curling gables that seemed to float like the wings of a crane in flight. From a distance, it looked serene, elegant, even graceful, the kind of beauty that painters and poets praised in delicate brushstrokes. But standing at the base of its outer moat, staring up at the sheer stone walls that tilted inward like a trap, you understood the real message. This was not a decoration. This was dominance carved into the earth itself. The Lord's fortress was more than his home. It was the anchor that held the entire world of the castle town in place, the sun around which every life revolved, whether they wished it or not. The morning mist clung to the moat water, curling around the broad stone embankments. A heron stood motionless at the edge, its long neck curved, watching for fish. On the far side, the massive wooden bridge leading to the main gate was still empty. The merchants, farmers, and laborers who would cross it each day were waiting for the hour when the gates would open. The bridge itself could be dismantled or destroyed in minutes if an enemy approached. But most days it served as the town's main artery, the path that brought goods, news, and people in and out of the Lord's domain. Beneath it, the dark green water hid its depth well. Even if you could swim, crossing the moat without permission would be an invitation to die. The air smelled faintly of wet wood and the faint, smoky tang of last night's cooking fires from the town beyond. The streets were still quiet here, but faint sounds drifted across the water. The creak of a cartwheel, the thud of a mallet shaping fresh rice cakes, the rhythmic sweep of a broom against packed dirt. The town was waking, and every movement was part of an unspoken rhythm that had existed for generations. Farmers rose earlier than anyone, walking the narrow dirt paths to the outer rice fields, while the castle was still a shadow in the pre-dawn. Merchants uncovered their stalls, fishermen untangled their nets, and the samurai, those whose entire lives revolved around service and vigilance, performed their morning drills within the castle's inner courtyards. The castle's power radiated outward like ripples in a pond. Closest to the fortress, inside its layers of walls and gates, lived the high-ranking retainers, samurai who could be summoned at a moment's notice to guard, advise, or fight. Their homes were neat and orderly, with sliding paper screens and roofs of dark tiles, set along perfectly straight streets designed for both beauty and military efficiency. These inner roads were wide enough for mounted patrols and, if needed, for the swift movement of troops during an attack. Even in peace, their openness gave the sense that eyes were always on you, and they were. Further out, beyond the last defensive wall, the streets began to twist and narrow. This was the town proper, where the merchants, artisans, and common folk lived. The closer your house or shop was to the castle, the higher your status, at least in the eyes of your neighbors. Those closest might supply the Lord's kitchens directly, craft weapons for his soldiers, or produce silk for his robes. Those further out might deal in everyday necessities, selling sake, sandals, or paper fans. And beyond them, in the farthest districts at the edge of the moat's reach, were the farmers and laborers whose work kept everyone else alive, but whose proximity to the castle was a rare privilege granted only to those deemed trustworthy. Every building faced the castle. That wasn't an accident. Even when streets curved to follow the terrain, the main entrances of homes and shops tended to be angled toward the fortress, as though bowing in silent respect. Some said it was for luck, others because it made it easier for the authorities to watch for trouble. Either way, it reinforced a truth no one dared forget. You lived in the shadow of the Lord's gaze. At the heart of the castle itself, in chambers few would ever see, the Lord rose with the morning sun. His attendants had already prepared the day's garments, layered silk robes for formal audiences, or lighter attire if he planned to spend the morning inspecting his lands. His breakfast would be ready within moments, a meal as carefully arranged as a piece of calligraphy. Grilled river fish, pickled vegetables, steaming rice, and a small dish of miso soup. But before that, his retainers would present the day's reports. Who had entered and left the town the day before, which merchants had paid their taxes, whether any strangers had appeared without introduction. A castle town might look peaceful, but it was a living network of obligations, alliances, and constant surveillance. Outside, the first travelers of the day began to arrive. A farmer with baskets of fresh greens balanced on a pole across his shoulders waited at the gate, bowing low to the guard who inspected his load. A silk merchant from a neighboring province, dressed in a faded but clean kimono, offered a travel permit written on rice paper, sealed with an official mark. No one entered without such permission, not even the poorest peddler. The guards, usually lower-ranking samurai or well-trained ashigaru foot soldiers, inspected every bundle, every cart, every barrel. They were not just looking for weapons or contraband. They were looking for signs of deceit, for the faintest tremor of hesitation in a person's voice. Smuggling goods without paying the Lord's tax was theft. Smuggling information to a rival domain was treason. Both were punishable without mercy. The people of the town had long since learned the small rules that governed daily life here. You did not walk through the main gate of the castle itself unless summoned. You did not carry a weapon longer than a short blade unless you were a samurai. You did not speak ill of the Lord or his family, not even in whispers, because walls had ears, and rumors had a way of reaching the wrong person. Punishments could be swift and public. A man flogged at the gate for cheating weights in his shop. A woman made to kneel in the square for spreading dangerous gossip. The message was always the same. The order of the castle town was not to be disturbed. By mid-morning, the streets had transformed from quiet lanes to a steady flow of bodies and voices. Merchants called out their wares: fresh daikon radishes, sweet bean cakes, bolts of dyed cotton, while children darted between stalls, carrying small errands for their families. The air filled with the smells of miso broth simmering in large pots, freshly planed cedar from a carpenter's workshop, and the faint saltiness of fish just brought in from the river. On some days, traveling entertainers would pass through, performing short acts in the open space near the market. A storyteller with a folding fan, a juggler balancing on a bamboo pole, or a pair of dancers moving in perfect unison. But even their art was a form of tribute. Many performed first for the lord's household before taking to the public streets. Above it all, the castle loomed, its watchtowers positioned so that soldiers could see the entire town at once. The samurai stationed there did not idle. They were constantly scanning for signs of fire, fights, or suspicious gatherings. And the townspeople, for their part, had learned to pretend they did not notice the watchful eyes, even as they adjusted their behavior in their presence. It was not paranoia. It was survival. The days passed like this, each one shaped by centuries of tradition and the silent, unshakable understanding that the Lord's will was law. Disobedience was rare, not because people did not have grievances, but because they knew the price. The castle at the center of everything was not just a building. It was a reminder carved into the skyline. Here, you were part of a system, and no one dared stand outside it. The streets of a Japanese castle town were not laid out for ease of travel, nor for beauty, nor even for the comfort of the people who walked them every day. They were a maze, shaped by the invisible hand of control. From above, if one could somehow float over the rooftops and gaze down, they looked less like the neat grids of later cities and more like a coiled serpent, twisting in deliberate patterns. Every bend, every sudden turn, every dead end was not a mistake of poor planning. It was intentional. A message written in stone, dirt, and timber. You are being watched, and your movements can be controlled. To walk these streets for the first time was disorienting. A narrow lane might lead straight for 100 paces before abruptly curving so tightly that the walls of houses nearly brushed your shoulders. That curve was no accident. It was there to slow mounted soldiers, to force attackers into single file, to break the momentum of any rush toward the castle gates. A stranger could not see the castle straight ahead for long. It vanished from sight, then reappeared around another bend, almost tauntingly. The people who lived here learned the turns by heart. Their feet knew when to shift left or right without thinking. But the design was never for them. It was for the defense of the Lord, and by extension, for the constant reminder that the streets belonged to authority, not to the people. The ground underfoot was often uneven. Some lanes were paved with flat stones, smooth in the center from countless sandals and wooden clogs passing over them. Others were packed dirt, hard in the dry season and slick in the rain. Drainage was poor by modern standards, so puddles lingered after storms, gathering the floating petals of cherry blossoms in spring, and in summer, collecting a green skin of algae if the days stayed wet. The air in those narrow streets carried every smell: grilled fish from a food stall, damp straw mats drying on a veranda, smoke from a brazier, and sometimes the sharper tang of the night soil cart making its way to the fields. Along each winding lane, houses and shops leaned toward the road, their wooden beams darkened by years of smoke and weather. The eaves jutted out far enough that, on a rainy day, a person could walk the center of the street and still feel droplets running down the back of their neck. Light filtered into these lanes differently, depending on the time of day. In the morning, golden shafts pierced between rooftops, but by afternoon, the sun's angle left them in cool shade. That shade was a relief in the heat, but in winter, it made the streets feel like long, shadowed corridors where the wind whistled between the gaps in the buildings. Yet comfort was never the main concern here. Those shadows were useful for patrols. Watchmen, often armed with spears and wearing the crest of the local lord, strolled the lanes at measured paces. They knew every shortcut, every alley that looked like it might lead to an escape. Their eyes scanned faces, noting who was meant to be there and who was not. Outsiders could not slip through unnoticed. The streets themselves betrayed them, slowing their steps, forcing them to reveal themselves at choke points. It wasn't just the curves and turns that created this control. It was the choke points themselves. In certain places, a road would narrow so much that only one or two people could pass at a time. Wooden gates could be swung shut here in moments, barring the way entirely. In other areas, a small guard post stood at the corner, its presence blending into the architecture but always occupied, its watchmen sipping tea and exchanging quiet words while never truly relaxing their gaze. For the townspeople, the winding streets became part of the rhythm of life. Children played in them, darting around corners and laughing when their friends couldn't find them right away. Merchants used the curves to their advantage, setting up stalls just beyond a bend, so that customers had to come closer before they could see what was for sale. At night, Lanterns were hung from eaves and posts, their flickering light making the narrow streets seem almost dreamlike or unsettling, depending on one's mood. But beneath the everyday bustle, the message of those streets never vanished. When a messenger from the castle passed through, the streets cleared and people bowed. When samurai strode along, their swords at their sides, conversations hushed, and the sound of their wooden sandals echoed more sharply against the walls. The streets were a stage, and every interaction was part of a performance where everyone knew their place. And if trouble ever came, if there was even the faintest hint of rebellion or outside threat, the design of the streets would show its true purpose. Soldiers could block off lanes in moments, sealing entire districts. Archers could take positions in windows and balconies above the bends. An enemy force that did not know the layout would find themselves turning and turning, seeing the same rooftops from a dozen angles, but never gaining ground toward the castle. The twisting lanes would sap their energy and their will, while the defenders above would rain down whatever was needed to break them. For those who lived their lives entirely within this winding maze, it was simply the shape of their world. The turns led them home. The narrow spaces were where neighbors exchanged greetings, where shopkeepers swept their doorsteps, where children chased the drifting petals of spring. But they also knew, even if they did not say it aloud, that every step they took was within a system meant to watch, to slow, to control. And so the streets of the castle town were more than mere paths from one place to another. They were silent sentinels, guiding the flow of life under the watchful eyes of the castle walls. They made sure that no matter how far you walked, you never forgot who truly ruled here. They were always there. You could feel them before you saw them, the quiet weight of their presence pressing into the air like an invisible hand on your shoulder. The samurai moved through the streets of the castle town with the measured steps of men who never hurried, because they never needed to. They weren't simply walking. They were watching. Every glance from beneath the shadow of their helmets could stop a conversation mid-sentence, freeze a child mid-step, or turn a merchant's friendly smile into a nervous grimace. They didn't shout orders, didn't need to bark commands. The rules were already known. Every man, woman, and child in the town had learned them by heart, not from scrolls or proclamations, but from the sharp memory of seeing what happened to someone who forgot. A dropped bow, a missed bow, a pause too long in speaking, a whisper overheard in the wrong company. Such things didn't go unnoticed. The samurai noticed everything. The clang of armor was rare. They moved with an eerie silence, their long swords swaying at their sides, hands never far from the hilts. The sight of that steel was enough. It gleamed even on cloudy days, as though reminding the townspeople that its edge was always ready. They didn't have to draw it often. Fear did the work before the blade did. Children were taught early to lower their eyes and keep their voices soft when a samurai passed. Older men stepped aside, bowing at the waist, and women pulled their sleeves close, as though tightness might protect them from scrutiny. Even the town's stray dogs seemed to sense their authority, slipping into alleys as the warriors approached. The patrol routes were never announced, never posted. That was the point. A samurai could appear around any corner, at any hour, day or night. And when they did, people adjusted their postures, their words, their faces, as though a sudden, invisible thread had pulled them taut. The markets grew quieter. Laughter died down. A hand reaching for an extra handful of grain thought better of it. Those who lived in the castle town understood something outsiders did not. The samurai weren't merely protecting the lord. They were the lord's eyes, ears, and, when necessary, his hand. Every movement they made, every pause, every glance was a reminder that this was not a place of freedom. It was a place of order, and that order was enforced by men who lived by the sword and could end a life with as little thought as one might give to swatting a fly. Yet their presence was not entirely unwelcome. Bandits avoided these streets. Thieves were rare. Disputes rarely erupted into brawls. The calm was real, but it was the calm of a pond where predators lurked just below the surface, still yet dangerous. People could walk safely at night, but they did so knowing that the samurai who ensured their safety could just as easily turn that same power upon them. The samurai's watchful eyes reached into the very rhythm of life. Festivals, weddings, funerals, all unfolded under their gaze. Even joy had to be careful here. A drunken song that insulted the wrong family, a celebratory display that seemed too extravagant for one's rank. Such things could lead to trouble. The townspeople learned to measure their happiness, to temper it, because excess drew attention, and attention was dangerous. In the stillness of early morning, when the mist curled low between the buildings, a lone samurai might be seen at the far end of a street, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the pale light. He would stand there for a long moment, unmoving, until you realized he was not simply looking down the street, he was looking at you. And then, slowly, he would move on, leaving behind the uneasy knowledge that you had been noticed. Over time, this constant observation shaped the soul of the castle town. People became careful with their words, precise with their gestures. They dressed modestly, not only from humility, but from caution. They learned to keep secrets, to mask emotions, to bow deeply, even when the back ached. The samurai didn't need to speak to enforce the Lord as law. They had woven it into the very air of the streets. And so the people lived, worked, and grew old under those watchful eyes, knowing that in this place, even silence could be dangerous, and every step was taken under the shadowed steel. Merchants in the castle town woke each morning to the same reality. Their livelihood was not entirely their own. It was a truth they understood from the day they first set up shop, and it hovered over every coin exchanged, every ledger entry, and every deal struck. Their stalls and storehouses stood only a short walk from the Lord's fortress, and that proximity came with an invisible chain. The castle did not simply protect the town, it controlled it, and the merchants were among the most closely bound to that control. The taxes were not occasional, nor were they mild. They were constant, deliberate, and unyielding. They took many forms, some obvious, some cleverly hidden. Official levies were announced at the beginning of the year, their amounts calculated by the castle's administrators and recorded in thick scrolls. But beyond these official demands, there were the quiet extractions fees for using certain roads, charges for weighing goods on the castle scales, payments for the right to sell in the most profitable locations. Nothing moved through the market without being noticed. Nothing escaped the watchful eyes of the men who kept the castle's accounts. A merchant might wake to the clatter of wooden shutters being pulled open, letting in the cool morning air. Outside, the market square was already alive with the sound of voices, carts rolling over uneven stones, and the faint scent of steamed rice drifting from food stalls. The merchants' apprentices would sweep the front steps and arrange goods for display bright bolts of cloth, bundles of dried fish, jars of pickled vegetables. Each item represented not only the work of sourcing, preparing, and transporting, but also the tax that would be paid before the day was done. Some merchants tried to factor the taxes into their prices. Others took the loss and prayed for better luck next season. But the castle had a way of ensuring that no one grew too wealthy without sharing generously with the Lord as treasury. If a trader's sales began to soar, if their storehouse filled more quickly than usual, someone from the castle would notice. A polite inquiry would be made, perhaps a request for a temporary contribution to help with repairs to the castle gate or to supply food for a visiting dignitary. Refusal was unthinkable. Compliance was the only way to survive. It wasn't just about the money. The taxation system reinforced a deeper message, that the castle allowed prosperity only by its own permission. Merchants were free to operate, but only within the boundaries the Lord had drawn. Their prosperity could be trimmed like the branches of a tree, kept from overshadowing the power at the town center. This was not an unspoken rule. It was something every merchant learned, sometimes painfully. There were stories passed down in the marketplace, whispered in the quiet hours after stalls were shuttered for the night. One tale told of a merchant who had tried to smuggle goods past the castle's toll collectors by sending them along a hidden footpath outside town. For a short time, it seemed the scheme had worked. He sold at lower prices than his rivals, undercutting them and gaining customers. But word reached the wrong ears, and the punishment was swift. The man's storehouse was seized, his goods confiscated, and his name erased from the market registry. Within weeks, he was gone from the town entirely, a cautionary shadow for the rest. Yet despite the weight of taxation, merchants did not leave in droves. They endured. The castle town was still a place of opportunity, though it came at a cost. A steady stream of travelers passed through samurai, officials, pilgrims, and messengers, each in need of food, lodging, or goods. For the skilled and patient merchant, there was money to be made, even after the lord's share was taken. The tax collectors may have been relentless, but they were also predictable. A wise trader learned the rhythms of the demands, set aside portions of their earnings, and navigated the system with quiet precision. Some merchants even managed to turn the taxation to their advantage. By forging relationships with the castle officials, through gifts, favors, or strategic marriages, they could secure better stall locations or receive advance notice of inspections. These alliances were risky, for a favor granted one day could be withdrawn the next. But in the intricate dance of commerce and power, such connections could mean the difference between thriving and barely scraping by. Daily life under this system carried a constant undercurrent of calculation. When a shipment of fresh tea arrived from the countryside, the merchant would consider not only the selling price, but also how much would be claimed by the castle. When a festival brought larger crowds to town, there was excitement, but also the certainty that the tax collectors would appear in greater numbers, moving through the crowd like quiet predators. Every deal was balanced between profit and obligation. There were moments when resentment stirred. A merchant might watch as heavily laden carts rolled up the road toward the castle gates, carrying the best rice, the finest silk, and the sweetest sake-all destined for the lord's stores, taken before they ever reached the townsfolk. In the dim light of a backroom meeting, voices would lower as merchants spoke of the burden, the endless drain of wealth upward. But these conversations never grew into open defiance. The memory of punishments past was too sharp, and the knowledge of the castle's reach too heavy. The taxes also shaped the very appearance of the marketplace. Instead of wide, ostentatious displays of goods, merchants favored modest arrangements. Wealth was concealed rather than flaunted. A successful trader might live in a well-kept house, but its exterior would be plain, its wooden walls weathered, its roof unremarkable. To appear too prosperous was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny meant more demands. For new arrivals, the system could be bewildering. A young merchant from the countryside might come to the castle town with dreams of fortune, only to find that every step forward was met with a hand extended in collection. They learned quickly, or they failed quickly. The veterans of the market gave little comfort, just quiet nods of acknowledgement, as if to say, "Yes, this is how it is here." Despite everything, the market remained vibrant. Stalls overflowed with goods. Customers haggled and laughed, and the air was rich with the mingled scents of spices, grilled fish, and fresh pine from carpenters' stalls. The weight of taxation was invisible to most visitors. It lived in the tight smiles of the merchants, in the way their hands lingered over each coin before passing it into the collector's box. It was a burden carried silently, woven into the very fabric of life beneath the watchful walls of the castle. In the end, taxation was not simply a financial matter. It was a form of control, a constant reminder that the castle's reach extended into every corner of the town. Merchants might have filled the streets with goods, and the air with the noise of trade, but the heartbeat of the market ultimately beat in time with the will of the Lord. And so they worked, they paid, and they endured knowing that their fortunes were never entirely their own, but always shared with the stone fortress that loomed above. Imagine walking through a bustling Japanese castle town in the mid-Edo period, the smell of grilled fish drifting from a street vendor's stall, the sound of wooden geta clacking over dusty roads, and the vibrant chatter of merchants calling out their wares. At first glance, the scene might seem colorful and free. Townspeople in patterned cotton robes, children darting between stalls, samurai standing at intersections like statues of authority. But beneath this bustle lay an invisible chain, a set of rigid, sumptuary laws that dictated not only how people lived, but even what they could wear. In a society where appearances were more than fashion, they were statements of loyalty, respect, and hierarchy. Clothing was a language everyone was forced to speak. Every thread, every accessory you owned was subject to scrutiny. You could not dress above your station, not even if you had the money. For commoners, this meant your clothing was not an expression of wealth or personality, but a reflection of your place in the feudal order. These laws were not born out of whimsy, but of control. In a Japan where the social structure was as precise as a samurai's blade, the ruling class feared that the lines between samurai, merchants, artisans, and farmers might blur if appearances were allowed to mingle. A merchant, though rich from trade, could not appear more distinguished than a low-ranking samurai. That would be unacceptable. The visual hierarchy had to be maintained at all times, and the clothing one wore was a constant public reminder of it. For commoners, this meant duller, cheaper fabrics. Cotton was standard, though even that had limits. Certain patterns or dyes were restricted. Indigo, for instance, was common and allowed for working people, but brighter colors like crimson or saffron yellow were often forbidden unless you had the rank to wear them. Silks, brocades, or gold-threaded garments. Absolutely out of the question for anyone outside the upper classes. Even hairstyles were regulated, with elaborate arrangements reserved for those of higher standing. A commoner woman might have to settle for simpler knots or single hairpins, while the wives of samurai could adorn their hair with multiple combs and ornamental kanzashi. The penalties for breaking these rules were not merely fines. In some cases, the punishment could be public humiliation, being paraded through the streets in the offending garment, or having it confiscated and destroyed. In more severe cases, especially if the act was seen as a deliberate challenge to authority, the offender could face imprisonment or worse. It was understood that dressing above one's station was not just vanity, it was rebellion in cloth form. The irony, of course, was that merchants, some of the wealthiest people in castle towns, often found themselves in a strange trap. They had the money to afford luxury, but the law demanded they appear humble. This led to the rise of subtle extravagance. Merchants commissioned garments with plain outer layers, but luxurious linings hidden inside, silks, intricate patterns, and rich colors that only they knew they wore. It was a quiet act of defiance, a way to savor their wealth without drawing the gaze of the authorities. Tailors, too, had to navigate these laws carefully. They became masters of restraint, designing clothes that complied with the letter of the law while hinting at the client's means. A commoner's kimono might have an understated pattern that was still technically allowed, but cut with expert precision that spoke to quality craftsmanship. These artisans knew how to work within the boundaries, much like a painter restricted to a single color who still manages to create a masterpiece. This visual system of control extended to festivals and ceremonies. Even during celebrations, when townspeople gathered to honor the gods or enjoy a seasonal event, the lines between classes were visible in every crowd. The samurai families would arrive in stately silks, their crests boldly displayed, while commoners stood in their cotton robes, often patterned with humble motifs like waves, reeds, or geometric designs. Everyone knew their place, and everyone could see everyone else's place too. These laws also served another purpose, reinforcing the authority of the castle itself. A lord as retainers and administrators could immediately identify a person as social standing just by glancing at their attire. This made it easier to monitor gatherings, keep track of who was where, and ensure no one stepped outside the role they had been assigned by birth. The clothing restrictions were less about fashion and more about turning every street into a living diagram of feudal hierarchy. Yet for all their strictness, these rules also gave rise to a kind of cultural creativity. People found ways to personalize their appearance within the restrictions, carefully choosing the shade of indigo that best suited them, adding a discreet stitch of colored thread along a hem, or using texture and fabric quality to stand out subtly. Sung took pride in working within the rules to create something beautiful, a testament to resilience under control. Still, the shadow of punishment was never far away. An accidental breach, perhaps a gift of a forbidden hair ornament from a visiting relative, could draw suspicion. Gossip traveled fast in a castle town, and a whisper in the wrong ear could result in a summons from a magistrate. The fear of being accused kept most commoners firmly within their prescribed limits, no matter how much they longed for a splash of forbidden color. In the end, the sumptuary laws of a Japanese castle town were more than a dress code. They were a constant reminder of who you were allowed to be. Your clothing was both a uniform and a cage, marking you as part of a tightly controlled society where ambition had to be hidden beneath plain cloth. And while the marketplace might be filled with noise and movement, the true power was silent, stitched into every sleeve and woven into every thread. Even today, when looking at old woodblock prints of castle towns, you can still see the visual separation, the way the samurai stand. Apart, the merchants and artisans blend together in their work robes, and the farmers appear in their simple functional garb. These were not just artistic choices. They were accurate depictions of a society where even the fabric on your back was part of the political order. The evening bell always came at the same time, yet it never failed to send a subtle shiver through the streets. Its tone was deep and heavy, rolling over the rooftops of the castle town like a wave of finality. The sound echoed along the narrow lanes, bounced off wooden facades, and seeped into every doorway. For some, it was simply a reminder of the day's end. For others, it was the sound of doors closing, of walls closing in, of freedom suspended until morning. The bell was not just a practical marker of time. It was a warning. It told the merchants to roll down their shop shutters and count the day's earnings quickly. It told the fishermen by the riverside to pull in their last nets and haul the baskets away before the gates clanged shut. It told the children that their laughter and running feet had reached their limit for the day. And above all, it told every resident that the power of the castle now rested not only in the walls and the warriors, but in the control of movement itself. As the sound faded, a subtle shift rippled through the town. The market chatter thinned. The smell of grilling fish and roasting vegetables still hung in the air, but it was now joined by the soft creak of sliding doors being shut and barred. Footsteps quickened on the main street, people eager to be indoors before the final drumbeat at the gates. In the fading light, shadows grew long and sharp, and the watchful figures of samurai patrols became more visible, not rushing but moving with that slow, deliberate pace that told everyone they had all the time in the world to spot a straggler. The curfew was not negotiable. Once the gates closed, the outside world might as well have been on the other side of the ocean. Heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bolts were swung into place, the sound of them meeting their frame ringing out like the seal on a prison. Above, guards leaned over the battlements, their faces half in shadow, half in the glow of torches. Inside, life continued, but contained, compressed into the tight alleys and houses that huddled beneath the looming castle keep. For the townspeople, the curfew was both safety and suffocation. The official reasoning was that closing the gates protected everyone from bandits. enemy scouts, or fires started by those with ill intent. And in truth, there were fewer incidents of crime at night, at least the kind committed by outsiders. But within the walls, the restriction also served as a constant reminder of who truly controlled the rhythm of life. If you were locked out after the bell, there was no mercy. Whether you had been caught outside because of an unexpected delay at a distant field, or because you'd lingered too long at a friend's house, the result was the same. You spent the night exposed beyond the safe embrace of the walls. Some nights, faint calls could be heard from beyond the gate, a desperate voice pleading with the watch to open up, to make an exception. But exceptions were rare, and even then, the decision rested entirely on the mood of the guards. Sometimes, the cries faded into silence. Other times, they were drowned out by the wind or the steady beat of a drum, signaling the change of the watch. Inside the town, life adapted to the curfew's rhythms. Families gathered around low tables in the flickering light of oil lamps, sharing the evening meal. Conversations softened as the night deepened. Outside, the streets grew still. Only the guards walked them now, their armor occasionally clinking as they passed under the lanterns. Their shadows stretched across the walls, like dark reminders of the rules everyone lived under. The curfew's power was not just physical, but psychological. Even those with no intention of going outside felt its weight. The knowledge that you could not leave, even if you wished to, created a quiet tension in the air. It made the walls feel taller, the streets narrower. The mind began to notice things it ignored in the bustle of day, the way the wind whistled between roof tiles, the faint smell of the moat drifting on a damp night, the sound of a dog barking somewhere in the darkness beyond the gate. For travelers and merchants from distant lands, the system was often startling. In their home villages, the day's end might be marked only by the setting sun. Here, time itself seemed under the Lord's command. Some tried to argue their way past the rules, pointing to their goods or their official papers, but quickly learned that the bell did not care for status unless it was sanctioned from the castle. The gates obeyed only the schedule, and the schedule obeyed only the will of the Lord. On festival days, the curfew was both lifted and reinforced in different ways. During celebrations, lanterns lit the streets well into the night, music spilled from open-fronted tea houses, and people laughed together under banners that fluttered in the warm evening air. Yet even then, the castle maintained control. The extra hours of freedom were granted, not earned, and could be withdrawn without warning. And when the final festival drumbeat signaled the true curfew, it came with an almost military precision, the joyous noise cutting to silence as the town collectively stepped back into obedience. The samurai tasked with enforcing the curfew often did so without words. Their presence was enough. A lone figure standing at a crossroads, hand resting on the hilt of a sword, was a quiet but unmistakable message. The night belongs to the Lord. If someone was foolish enough to defy the curfew, their punishment could range from a stern warning to something far harsher, depending on the infraction and the political mood of the moment. Over time, the curfew became as much a part of the town's identity as its markets, temples, or festivals. Children grew up with the bell as a constant marker in their lives. Elders could remember the rare occasions when the bell did not sound, times of war or disaster when normal life was suspended entirely. In those moments, the absence of the curfew bell was even more unsettling than its presence, as if the world had slipped out of its familiar order. Behind closed doors, people sometimes whispered their thoughts about the curfew. Was it truly for their safety, or was it a way to keep them under control? Most did not dare voice such questions openly. The walls had ears, as the saying went, and loose words could travel quickly in a place where every face might belong to a loyal informant. The night in a Japanese castle town was not empty. It had its own life. The muted shuffle of guards, the low murmur of voices from houses where candles still burned, the faint clatter of dishes being washed behind shuttered windows. but it was a life shaped by boundaries. The curfew drew an invisible line across the town, separating freedom from confinement, and it was a line no one crossed without permission. When dawn came and the gates creaked open again, the spell of the curfew broke instantly. People poured out to the fields, to the riverside, to the roads that led to neighboring villages. The streets filled with carts, the air with the calls of vendors. But the memory of the night, of being enclosed, watched, and bound by rules, lingered quietly in the background, ready to return with the next toll of the bell. Servants, beggars, and innkeepers, these were the faces you passed daily, the ones who smiled, bowed, and carried on with their ordinary routines. But in a Japanese castle town, appearances were as carefully managed as the streets themselves. Many of those faces had listening ears and careful eyes, quietly collecting what you said, what you did, and even who you met. This was not random gossip. It was an organized network of informants working for the lord, the samurai, or the town magistrates. The goal was simple: control. A castle town could only function if its people remained loyal, or at least fearful enough not to rebel. And to achieve that, those in power needed to know what was whispered behind closed doors. You might be at the tea house, enjoying a quiet cup with a friend, and mention a grievance about taxes or a dispute with a neighbor. The innkeeper behind the counter, who seemed absorbed in polishing cups, might later mention your complaint to a passing official, not in a dramatic way, but casually, as though sharing harmless chatter. That casual remark could lead to a quiet visit from a samurai, asking you questions you suddenly realized you couldn't answer without getting into trouble. These informants weren't always paid spies. Some were loyal retainers or servants of the lord's household who owed their entire livelihood to his favor. Others were common townsfolk pressured into reporting because of debt, fear, or promises of protection. A few even volunteered, seeing it as a way to gain prestige or prove their loyalty. Beggars, in particular, were effective informants. They moved freely, unnoticed, and often overheard things others missed. A beggar sitting by a bridge or temple entrance could hear every rumor and watch every face that passed. Sometimes they were given small payments, food, coins, or even scraps of clothing, in exchange for what they knew. And in a society where social mobility was nearly impossible, even these small rewards could be enough to buy loyalty. The effect on daily life was profound. In a castle town, you learned to speak carefully, never raising your voice or making accusations unless you were certain of your company. Friends might meet in remote fields or forests to talk freely, but even then, they glanced over their shoulders. Every word had weight, and the walls seemed to have ears, because in a way, they did. Over time, this constant awareness shaped the way people behaved. Politeness became a shield. Public smiles masked private thoughts. Neighbors greeted one another warmly, but kept true feelings hidden. And behind the cheerful bustle of market day or festival night, there was an invisible web of observation that never stopped tightening. In the eyes of the castle, this was not cruelty, it was necessity. An unhappy or rebellious town could quickly become dangerous, especially in an era where rival lords and clans constantly looked for opportunities to undermine one another. By embedding spies into everyday life, the lord ensured that no uprising could grow unnoticed. The castle stayed secure, not just through stone walls and armed guards, but through the quiet, calculated work of those who blended in so perfectly that you never knew you'd been watched. And so, in the shadow of the keep, life went on. A life where every conversation was a performance, every friendship was a careful calculation, and every stranger might be the invisible hand of the castle's watchful power. In the market square of a Japanese castle town, life bustled with color, sound, and movement, but it all unfolded under the quiet, heavy gaze of the lord's watchman. Merchants in neat stalls hauled out their goods: lacquered bowls, fragrant miso paste, dried persimmons, silk thread dyed in deep indigo. Women in plain cotton kimono examined rice bundles, haggling softly with the vendor. Children darted between legs, chasing each other through the smell of grilled fish and fresh tea leaves. On the surface, it looked like a scene of ordinary trade, the kind you might find in any thriving town of the period. But here, every motion, every exchange, every murmur was observed. The guards stood at the edges of the market, spears in hand, their lacquered armor catching the light. They rarely spoke unless necessary. Their presence alone reminded everyone that the market was not a free place. It was a regulated space, an extension of the castle's authority. These guards knew the merchants by name, knew which customers returned regularly, and even noticed when a transaction took longer than it should. They weren't just protecting the market from thieves. They were ensuring that no one evaded taxes, made deals in secret, or gathered in ways that might trouble the social order. Merchants had their stalls placed in locations assigned by the castle authorities, not chosen freely. Those closer to the main thoroughfare, where customers flowed more easily, had to pay extra tribute for the privilege. Those in the back corners might sell less, but they still had to pay their dues on time. Every sack of rice, every roll of cloth, every barrel of sake was recorded. Even the scales and weights used to measure goods were inspected to ensure they matched official standards. If they didn't, punishment was swift. A fine, confiscation of goods, or in serious cases, a public display of shame that could ruin a merchant's reputation. For customers, the watchful eyes meant thinking twice before making certain purchases. A samurai might notice if a commoner bought something deemed above their station, perhaps a finely woven silk sash or an ornate comb. That could lead to uncomfortable questions later. The market was a place to get what you needed, but also a place where your choices became part of a silent report folded into the castle's understanding of its subjects. The atmosphere carried a duality. On one hand, the market was the lifeblood of the town, a place where farmers brought vegetables from the countryside. Fishermen sold their morning catch, and artisans displayed months of careful work. On the other, it was a stage for the performance of obedience. Smiles were exchanged, polite bows given, and coin purses opened. But behind it all was the knowledge that a wrong word, a wrong price, or a wrong purchase could bring trouble. Some merchants learned to navigate this system with skill, cultivating good relationships with the guards, offering them small gifts or preferred prices to ensure smoother inspections. Others kept their heads down, selling only what was safe, speaking only when spoken to. The guards themselves were not always harsh. Sometimes they were bored, even friendly, but their role meant they could never fully be seen as ordinary neighbors. By midday, the market would swell with voices and the clatter of trade. The sound of wooden geta sandals on the packed earth, mixed with the splash of water as fishmongers rinsed their goods. Overhead, the sky might be wide and blue, but the shadow of the castle's high walls fell across the stalls, a visual reminder of who truly owned this space. Even the air seemed to carry the castle's authority, as if the entire town breathed in time with its master. And when the day's business was done, the market emptied in an orderly fashion. Merchants packed their goods carefully, locked up storage boxes, and bowed to the guards on their way out. The guards watched until the last stall was covered and the square lay quiet. The space belonged to the people for only a few hours a day. The rest of the time, it belonged entirely to the castle. The watchful eyes were not just about preventing crime. They were about ensuring loyalty, order, and an unbroken chain of authority. In the Japanese castle town, the market was more than a place of trade. It was a theater of power, where commerce was allowed to flourish only within the bounds the Lord set. Every coin exchanged under those watchful eyes was a small, unspoken acknowledgement. All of this exists because the castle allows it. In a Japanese castle town, the air was thick, not just with the scent of cooking fires fish from the market, or dust stirred by wooden cartwheels. but with an invisible weight, the unspoken rule that no one dared speak ill of the Lord. It was a rule more deeply rooted than the stones in the castle walls, and one that shaped every conversation, every whispered exchange, every choice of words that passed between lips. The idea of criticizing even lightly the man who ruled from the high keep was not only dangerous, it was almost unthinkable. The fear wasn't born purely from superstition or blind loyalty, though both had their place. It came from centuries of precedent, a long and bloody history that proved the Lord's wrath was not a thing to tempt. Punishment for slander, or even perceived disrespect, could be merciless. Confiscation of property, public humiliation, exile, or a death designed to serve as a warning. In the minds of the people, the Lord was not a politician who could be debated. He was the unshakable center of their world, the provider of order and justice, but also the source of punishment and ruin if that order was challenged. Even within the walls of one's own home, voices were kept low when the topic of the castle arose. Sliding doors were thin, windows sometimes left ajar, and neighbors, even family members, could be ears for the wrong audience. A careless complaint about taxes, a bitter remark about the soldiers, or a mocking comment about the Lord's habits could travel faster than the speaker ever imagined. And in a town where informants often hid in plain sight, a single overheard sentence could mean the difference between safety and ruin. For merchants, artisans, and travelers alike, this unwritten law demanded constant self-control. Conversations in the marketplace stayed light, even when frustration boiled just beneath the surface. If someone complained about their hardships, they'd blame bad luck or the season, never the policies or taxes of the ruling household. Performers, storytellers, musicians, actors carried the heaviest burden. Any play, song, or tale that seemed to mock the castle, even in jest, could be interpreted as sedition. This gave rise to a subtle, coded form of performance, where clever artists learned to speak in metaphors, using far-off lands or mythical creatures to disguise their commentary. Yet, for many townspeople, silence was easier than subterfuge. Entire families taught their children from a young age, "You may think what you wish, but you never speak against the Lord." The lesson wasn't just about fear of punishment. It was about survival in a tightly controlled social hierarchy. The Lord's honor was intertwined with the town's stability. Questioning it, openly or otherwise, could be seen as questioning the entire order that kept the walls standing and the gates guarded. Still, resentment had a way of finding cracks to seep through. In darkened inns after curfew, in storage rooms behind closed doors, in the hushed confines of a bathhouse, when the steam muffled voices, there, the truth could slip out. Friends might exchange a glance heavy with shared frustration, or mutter a complaint so softly it was almost a sigh. But even in these private moments, the fear never vanished. Every person knew someone, or knew of someone, who had spoken too freely and vanished soon after. The watchfulness was constant, and it bred a particular kind of discipline in speech. People became masters of omission, shaping sentences so they revealed nothing. Sarcasm was avoided. Too dangerous, too easily misread. Questions were phrased carefully, framed in a way that showed loyalty rather than doubt. Even when a disaster struck, a fire, a flood, a famine, the official narrative always placed the Lord beyond blame. Nature could be cruel, fate could be harsh, but the castle's authority remained untarnished. From the high stone keep, this silence served the Lord well. It meant unrest could be smothered before it became rebellion. The castle town functioned under the illusion of harmony, an illusion maintained by the constant, invisible pressure of fear. And for the commoner, it meant that no matter how unjust attacks felt, how heavy the curfew weighed, or how harsh the soldiers' discipline became, there was always one subject best left untouched. The result was a society where loyalty and fear were inseparably woven, where respect for authority was as natural as breathing, and where a single unwise sentence could destroy an entire life. The walls of the castle were built of stone, but the walls that guarded the Lord's reputation were made of silence, and they were far harder to breach. The air in the castle town carried more than the scent of cooking fires and market stalls. It carried the weight of fear, a constant, silent understanding that those in power could decide your fate in an instant. When punishment came, it was rarely hidden away. It was displayed, amplified, and etched into the minds of everyone watching. The purpose was never just to correct the offender. It was to make every man, woman, and child think twice before stepping out of line. Punishments ranged from fines and public shaming to brutal executions. Sometimes these sentences were carried out in the main square where the markets usually bustled. Merchants who had been loudly selling their wares only moments before would grow silent, their goods forgotten, as townsfolk gathered to witness. The condemned might be bound, kneeling under the watchful eyes of samurai, their faces pale but set with a mix of defiance and dread. The most common punishments were designed to humiliate rather than kill, because humiliation lasted longer in memory. Offenders might be forced to wear signs detailing their crime, or stand in a designated spot for hours, exposed to the mockery or scorn of their neighbors. This form of public penance turned private mistakes into collective lessons. No matter how small the offense, failing to pay a tax on time, speaking too casually about the Lord, the punishment was meant to linger like a bad taste in the mouth of the entire community. For more serious transgressions, the consequences were deadly. Samurai, under the Lord's orders, would sometimes carry out executions with precision and ceremony. A single swing of the blade could end a life, but the process leading up to it was intentionally drawn out. The condemned would often be paraded through the streets so that all could see their fate, whispers spreading through the crowd about what rule they had broken. By the time they reached the place of execution, the lesson was already absorbed. This is what happens when you challenge the order of the castle town. Punishment wasn't always about physical harm. Sometimes it was the slow dismantling of a person's life. Merchants could be stripped of the right to trade. Farmers could lose their plots of land. Families could be pushed into destitution without a sword being drawn, simply because they were declared out of favor. These quieter punishments were just as effective because they struck at the root of survival. Children grew up seeing these acts as part of daily life, their games sometimes imitating the trials they witnessed. For them, authority was not an abstract idea. It was the samurai who stood tall in the streets and the execution grounds that loomed at the edge of the market. By the time they reached adulthood, the rules were ingrained, not through speeches or laws on paper, but through a lifetime of observing the consequences. The power of these punishments lay in their visibility. The castle itself was the constant reminder of who ruled, but the public acts of discipline were what etched obedience into the bones of the town. Every lash of the whip, every public bow of shame, every swing of the sword was a message carved into the very rhythm of life. The Lord's will was not to be tested, and the price of defiance would always be paid in full. Under the clear blue skies of a midsummer morning, the town's main thoroughfare would transform into something almost unrecognizable. Stalls appeared where there had been empty spaces just the day before. Banners bearing the Lord's crest unfurled from every post, and the air filled with the aroma of grilled fish, steaming rice, and the sweet scent of festival cakes. From the outside, it seemed like pure joy, an escape from the routine of work, taxes, and silent obedience. But beneath the color and music, the festival was one of the Lord's most carefully crafted tools of control. These celebrations weren't simply thrown together for entertainment. Every part of them, from the sequence of events to the choice of performers, was planned to remind the people of who ruled, who protected, and who held the purse strings of the castle town. Even the scheduling was deliberate. Festivals often coincided with the completion of major projects ordered by the Lord, or they marked victories, alliances, or important family milestones in the ruling household. On such days, the townspeople weren't just invited to celebrate. They were summoned to participate. At the center of it all was spectacle. The processions, for example, were designed to impress as much as they were to delight. Samurai in lacquered armor marched in rigid formation, their helmets gleaming in the sun, while drummers beat out rhythms that echoed between the narrow streets. The Lord's household might be represented in a lavish palanquin, its curtains embroidered with gold thread, moving slowly so every eye could drink in the display. This wasn't merely pageantry. It was a living reminder of the wealth, power, and discipline the castle commanded. The performances themselves carried subtle messages. Dancers in brilliant costumes might act out legends of loyalty and sacrifice. Tales where the noble warrior protected his lord unto death. Storytellers recounted local history, but always in a way that glorified the ruling clan, painting them as wise protectors whose decisions had brought prosperity. Even the seemingly light-hearted games and contests reinforced values the Lord wanted to see in his subjects: teamwork, endurance, and respect for hierarchy. For the merchants, festivals were both a blessing and a burden. Crowds meant sales, but also scrutiny. The marketplace became a stage of its own, with guards weaving through the stalls to ensure traders displayed the right symbols of loyalty. It was also an opportunity for the Lord to show generosity, sometimes waiving certain taxes for the day or distributing small gifts of rice or sake. This wasn't charity for its own sake. It was calculated benevolence, a gesture that made the people feel indebted and reminded them that their well-being flowed from the castle as goodwill. For the commoners, the joy of the festival was real, but so was the pressure. Attendance was often expected, not optional, and those who stayed away without good reason risked drawing unwanted attention. The smiles, the dancing, the laughter, all of it existed under the watchful eyes of samurai and spies. Every cheer for the performers was also, in a way, a cheer for the Lord. When night fell, lanterns lit the streets, casting a warm, flickering glow over the crowd. Music rose into the dark sky, mingling with the scent of incense from temple ceremonies held in tandem with the festivities. This final act of the celebration was perhaps the most effective. People went home feeling uplifted, reminded of their place in the grand order of things, and convinced, even if only subconsciously, that their Lord's rule was not just inevitable but beneficial. In the end, festivals in a Japanese castle town are far more than moments of merriment. They were instruments of unity and control, weaving loyalty into the fabric of daily life with threads of song, dance, and ritual. The people laughed and celebrated together, but every bow, every cheer, and every clap of the drum echoed the same truth. In the shadow of the castle, joy itself served the power that ruled them. The presence of foreigners in a Japanese castle town was never taken lightly. From the moment a stranger approached the town's gates, their every movement was scrutinized. These were not places where outsiders could roam freely or blend unnoticed into the bustling streets. Instead, foreigners were met with a wary gaze, an invisible barrier of suspicion, reinforced by rigid laws and constant watchfulness. The safety of the town, and by extension, the Lord's power, depended on controlling who came and went, especially those who did not share the language, customs, or loyalty to the ruling clan. To enter the castle town, a foreigner needed more than just intent. They needed documentation. Special papers, often issued by higher authorities or trusted intermediaries, had to be presented to the guards stationed at every gate. These documents detailed the purpose of the visitor's journey, their destination, and a clear indication that they posed no threat. Without such papers, entry was denied, and in some cases, the stranger was turned away or even detained for questioning. This system of control was not merely bureaucratic. It was a protective measure born of real concerns. Foreigners could bring news from distant lands, but they might also carry dangerous ideas, diseases, or spies sent to undermine the Lord's rule. The castle town was a fortress, not only against physical attack, but against the erosion of its carefully maintained social order. Every new face was a potential risk, a wild card that could upset the fragile balance. For those permitted inside, life was far from easy. Foreigners were restricted in where they could live, often confined to designated quarters or outskirts, away from the heart of the town. They were watched closely by local authorities, and sometimes even by the samurai themselves. Any behavior that could be seen as suspicious, lingering too long in one place, speaking loudly, or attempting to make unauthorized contacts, was met with swift reprimand. Language barriers added to their isolation. Without fluency in Japanese, a foreigner's movements and intentions could easily be misunderstood. Miscommunication might lead to accusations of spying or disrespect, even if unintentional. This further reinforced the social distance between locals and strangers, making it difficult for foreigners to form relationships or integrate. The local population, taught from childhood to distrust outsiders, rarely showed hospitality to foreigners. While merchants and travelers might be tolerated for the economic benefit they brought, everyday citizens often viewed them with fear or hostility. Rumors about foreign plots, strange customs, or dangerous diseases spread quickly, deepening suspicion. For many townsfolk, a foreigner was a reminder that the castle town, though seemingly stable, was a world constantly under threat. This climate of suspicion affected every aspect of a foreigner's life. Trade was limited. Permits to buy or sell goods could be hard to obtain, and when granted, came with strict conditions. Foreign merchants often had to work through intermediaries who spoke Japanese and understood local customs, limiting their ability to negotiate or build trust. This system ensured that the economic benefits foreigners brought were tightly controlled, and that the local lord maintained a firm grip on all commerce within his domain. Social interaction outside of business was equally constrained. Foreigners rarely participated in local festivals or religious ceremonies, which were tightly interwoven with expressions of loyalty to the Lord. Invitations to social gatherings were rare, and even casual encounters in the marketplace could be fraught with tension. Many foreigners lived solitary lives, relying on small enclaves of compatriots for companionship. Despite these restrictions, some foreigners managed to carve out a niche in the castle town. Skilled artisans, translators, or traders who brought unique goods could gain a degree of acceptance, especially if they proved useful to the lord or his samurai. These individuals often acted as bridges between the local community and the wider world, navigating the delicate balance between suspicion and opportunity. However, even their positions were precarious. A single misstep could undo years of careful relationship building. The laws governing foreigners were reinforced by an extensive network of informants and spies. Locals were encouraged, sometimes rewarded, to report unusual behavior, particularly anything that might threaten the lord's authority. This culture of surveillance ensured that foreigners lived under constant watch, their privacy and freedom severely curtailed. It was a daily reminder that they were outsiders, guests in a world where every action was subject to scrutiny. In essence, the restrictions placed on foreigners in Japanese castle towns were a reflection of a society deeply committed to control and order. The walls of the castle did more than protect against physical enemies. They shielded a way of life that depended on loyalty, hierarchy, and tradition. Foreigners challenged those principles simply by their presence, and so the system responded with suspicion, regulation, and at times, outright hostility. This delicate tension between inclusion and exclusion shaped the social fabric of castle towns. While trade and exchange with the outside world were necessary for economic survival, they came at the cost of vigilance and control. The castle lord's power was not just in his sword or his army, but in his ability to dictate who belonged and who did not. Thus, for a foreigner entering a Japanese castle town, life was a constant negotiation between opportunity and limitation, acceptance and alienation. Every step was watched, every word weighed, and every gesture interpreted through a lens of caution. It was a world where hospitality was conditional, freedom was constrained, and survival depended on understanding the rules of a society that guarded its secrets as fiercely as its walls. In the heart of every Japanese castle town, the Lord's word was law, absolute, unchallengeable, and immediate. Unlike modern legal systems where rules are written, debated, and appealed, the castle town operated under a system where power was concentrated in the hands of one person, the Lord who ruled from his fortress atop the hill. His commands were final, his judgment swift, and his authority unquestioned. For the townsfolk, this meant that their lives, livelihoods, and even their very survival depended entirely on the whims and decisions of a single figure, whose voice could both grant favor or condemn in an instant. There was no formal court where grievances could be fairly presented, no panel of judges to weigh evidence, and no appeals process to reverse unjust decisions. The Lord's word could override centuries of tradition, countless precedents, and even the collective will of the community. If he decreed a tax increase, a trade restriction, or the punishment of a citizen, it was carried out without hesitation. This absolute power created an atmosphere of obedience, born not just of respect, but of fear. The knowledge that a life could be altered or ended with a single sentence loomed over every interaction in the town, shaping behavior down to the smallest detail. The Lord's commands were delivered through a tightly controlled chain of authority. Samurai officers, trusted retainers, and palace officials acted as his voice, carrying out orders with precision and enforcing them with force when necessary. These intermediaries were responsible for maintaining the delicate balance of power, ensuring that the town remained orderly and that the Lord's will was executed without question. Their presence was a constant reminder to the people that the ruling hand was never far away. For ordinary citizens, the consequences of the Lord's absolute authority were profound. Any dispute or conflict, whether between neighbors, merchants, or even family members, was subject to his final decision. Unlike modern courts, where evidence and argument might lead to nuanced outcomes, here decisions could be swift and brutal. Accusations alone might be enough to condemn someone, especially if they threatened the Lord's interests or challenged his authority. This lack of legal recourse meant that justice was often arbitrary, serving the needs of power rather than fairness. This system extended beyond criminal matters. The Lord's word influenced every aspect of daily life, from economic regulations and social customs to religious practices and public ceremonies. The townspeople understood that to defy or question the Lord was not only dangerous, but unthinkable. Silence, obedience, and conformity became survival tools, enabling people to navigate a world where the rules could shift with a single command. The absence of an appeals system also intensified the role of favoritism and intrigue. Those who earned the Lord's favor might find their lives transformed, debts forgiven, privileges granted, or punishments waived. Conversely, falling out of favor could lead to exile, confiscation of property, or worse. This unpredictability bred a culture of caution and, at times, deception. Alliances were carefully cultivated, and personal loyalty was as valuable as gold. The ability to read the Lord's moods, anticipate his desires, and present oneself as useful became essential skills. The Lord's absolute power also shaped the town's social hierarchy. The samurai class served not only as warriors, but as enforcers of his will, often enjoying privileges and authority over commoners. Their loyalty to the Lord was paramount, and they acted swiftly to suppress dissent or disorder. For the common people, this meant living under the watchful eyes of those who wielded both swords and authority, further reinforcing the centrality of the Lord's command in every facet of life. Even within the Lord's own household, the power dynamics were intense and complex. Members of the ruling family, high-ranking samurai, and influential courtiers all vied for influence, aware that proximity to the Lord could determine their fortunes. Decisions made within the castle walls rippled outward, affecting the entire town below. The lord's favor could elevate a retainer to wealth and power, or condemn a once prominent family to ruin with a single decree. The absolute nature of the Lord's word also discouraged collective action or rebellion. The risks of defying his authority were too great, and the mechanisms of control, from samurai patrols to informants, were deeply embedded in the town's fabric. Fear of punishment and the knowledge that appeals were impossible kept the population compliant, even when grievances were widespread. In this environment, obedience was not just a social expectation, but a survival necessity. Yet, the system was not without its cracks. History records instances where lords faced resistance, whether through secret alliances, covert protests, or open rebellion. These moments of defiance, though rare and often crushed, highlight the tension between absolute authority and human desire for justice and fairness. However, for most townsfolk living under the Lord's gaze, such resistance was too dangerous, and the Lord's word remained the final and unquestioned law. In the quiet moments, away from the bustling streets and watchful eyes, many residents might have whispered hopes for change, for a system where fairness prevailed, and justice could be sought without fear. But the reality of life in a Japanese castle town was stark. Power resided in the Lord's voice alone, and that voice could shape destinies with a single command. Leaving a Japanese castle town was far from a simple matter of packing belongings and walking away. The very fabric of these communities was woven tightly around control, order, and loyalty to the Lord who ruled from his fortress. Travel in and out of the town was not only restricted, but rigorously monitored. Any attempt to leave without official permission was viewed with extreme suspicion and could result in severe consequences. To the rulers and their samurai enforcers, an unauthorized departure was not just a breach of protocol, it was a direct threat to the stability and security of the domain, a sign of desertion or even treason. Gates stood at every major exit point of the town, manned by watchful guards who checked papers, questioned travelers, and scanned faces for signs of deceit. These gatekeepers were trained to spot those who might try to slip away unnoticed, whether commoners seeking freedom, merchants trying to evade taxes, or potential spies gathering intelligence for rival clans. The town's layout itself was designed to funnel movement through these checkpoints, ensuring that no one could come or go without being seen and recorded. The surveillance extended beyond the gates. Within the town, neighbors, servants, and even merchants kept a close eye on one another. Rumors of impending departure spread quickly through whispers and gossip. Informants could report suspicious behavior to the authorities, prompting samurai patrols to intervene before a would-be traveler could even reach the gate. In such an environment, the desire to leave had to be carefully concealed or risk exposure. Obtaining permission to leave the town was a complicated and often lengthy process. Citizens or visitors had to petition the Lord or his appointed officials, providing detailed reasons for their intended travel. This could include matters of trade, family emergencies, or official business. Even then, approval was not guaranteed. The Lord's officials weighed each request carefully, considering potential risks to security and the town's stability. Those deemed unnecessary or potentially dangerous were denied passage. For those who managed to secure permission, travel was still fraught with difficulty. Escorts might be assigned to accompany the traveler, ensuring they reached their destination and returned promptly. These escorts were not just guardians, but also enforcers, making sure the traveler did not deviate from the approved route or purpose. Any deviation could result in immediate recall, punishment, or accusations of betrayal. The consequences of unauthorized departure were severe and public. Being branded a deserter or traitor carried a heavy stigma that could extend beyond the individual to their family and associates. Punishments ranged from imprisonment and confiscation of property to exile or even execution, depending on the severity of the perceived offense and the Lord's disposition. Such harsh measures served as a powerful deterrent others who might consider fleeing the confines of the castle town. This strict control over movement reflected the broader priorities of the Lord's rule. The castle town was not merely a place of residence, but a tightly controlled political and military hub. Allowing free movement could invite espionage, rebellion, or loss of control over critical resources. In a world where loyalty was paramount, the ability to restrict travel helped maintain order and reinforce the social hierarchy. For commoners trapped by these restrictions, leaving the town was often a desperate dream. Many sought escape from poverty, heavy taxation, or social oppression, but found their paths blocked by both physical barriers and legal strictures. This sense of entrapment fostered a deep sense of resignation and, at times, despair. Stories circulated of those who attempted to flee only to be caught and harshly punished, their fates serving as grim warnings to others. Yet the desire to leave and seek a better life was a persistent undercurrent in the castle town. Some villagers hoped to join traveling merchants, find work in distant provinces, or escape the watchful eyes of the samurai. These aspirations, however, remained constrained by the rigid systems of control that governed every aspect of life. The tension between the yearning for freedom and the harsh reality of surveillance shaped much of the social fabric. Foreigners, already marginalized and restricted in many ways, faced even greater challenges when attempting to leave. Without strong local connections or understanding of the intricate approval processes, they risked being detained indefinitely or forced into unwanted labor. Their movements were scrutinized as potential threats, further isolating them from the community and limiting their opportunities. In this environment, even travel for official business was a source of anxiety. Merchants transporting goods faced constant inspections and delays, which could erode profits and hinder trade. Officials traveling to nearby towns had to navigate a labyrinth of permissions and escorts, balancing duty with the ever-present threat of suspicion. Despite these barriers, some managed to leave successfully, often through careful planning, bribery, or assistance from sympathetic insiders. These rare escapes highlighted both the human spirit's resilience and the limits of even the most rigid systems. But for most, the castle town's walls were not just stone and timber, they were invisible chains, binding them to a life of obedience and surveillance. The control over departure was part of a larger strategy to maintain the lord as dominance and prevent unrest. By regulating who could leave and who had to stay, the ruling class ensured that potential dissenters were contained. Economic activity remained taxable, and the social order stayed intact. It was a delicate balance, maintained through fear, law, and constant vigilance. Ultimately, the difficulty of leaving the castle town underscored the broader themes of power, control, and survival that defined life within its walls. For its inhabitants, every day was a negotiation between personal desire and political reality, freedom and obligation. The gates that kept enemies out also kept residents in, crafting a world where the price of departure was as high as the stakes of remaining. Life inside a Japanese castle town was governed not only by laws and edicts, but by an unspoken, deeply ingrained rule. Survival meant obedience. This rule was not written on any scroll or proclaimed by any herald, but it permeated every interaction, every glance, and every breath taken beneath the watchful eyes of the lord and his samurai. For those living within the shadow of the castle's towering walls, the delicate balance between life and death hinged on one simple principle: bow, obey, and never question. From childhood, the inhabitants of these towns were taught the importance of submission to authority. The social fabric was tightly woven with threads of hierarchy and loyalty. To question a command, to defy an order, or to show open dissent was to invite suspicion and danger. This obedience was not merely about respect or tradition. It was a practical necessity for survival in a system that brooked no challenge to the established order. The consequences of defiance could be swift and merciless, and the fear of such outcomes ensured that most kept their heads bowed and their voices low. The rule of obedience extended far beyond public conduct into private thoughts and feelings. Inwardly, many struggled with frustration, fear, and resentment, but outwardly, they wore masks of compliance. This duality created a culture of silence where true feelings were suppressed and conformity was rewarded. Public displays of loyalty were essential, often more important than genuine belief or affection. The ability to perform the expected rituals, whether in speech, posture, or action, became a skill as vital as any weapon. The samurai, as the enforcers of the Lord's will, embodied this principle of obedience with fierce discipline. They expected it from themselves and demanded it from others. Their training emphasized absolute loyalty, and their presence in the town served as a constant reminder that disobedience could mean death. For commoners, the samurai were both protectors and oppressors, guardians of peace, but also agents of control, ready to punish any hint of rebellion. This unspoken rule shaped every aspect of life, from the way people dressed and spoke to how they conducted business and interacted with neighbors. Even minor infractions could be seen as signs of disrespect or disloyalty. The line between obedience and betrayal was thin and often unclear, leading to an atmosphere of suspicion where trust was fragile and alliances were fragile. Within families, obedience took on a nuanced role. Elders and parents expected children to respect authority figures without question, reinforcing the social order from the earliest years. At the same time, survival often meant negotiating disobedience carefully, balancing respect with subtle acts of resistance or preservation of personal dignity. For many, this was a lifelong lesson in reading power dynamics and understanding when to speak and when to remain silent. Religious and cultural rituals further reinforced obedience. Ceremonies honoring the Lord, festivals celebrating his rule, and daily prayers to local deities all emphasized the importance of submission to a higher order. These rituals served not only spiritual functions, but also political ones, reminding the populace of their place within the hierarchy and their duty to maintain harmony through compliance. The unspoken rule also extended into the economic sphere. Merchants, craftsmen, and laborers knew that challenging the Lord's edicts or resisting taxation could bring ruin. Compliance ensured continued access to markets and resources, while defiance meant exclusion, punishment, or worse. This economic obedience helped maintain the Lord's wealth and the town's stability, even as it placed heavy burdens on the lower classes. However, obedience did not always mean passivity. Within the constraints imposed by authority, individuals found ways to negotiate their survival creatively. Compliance could be performed with subtlety, and loyalty could be expressed in ways that preserved some degree of autonomy. Acts of kindness, quiet solidarity, and whispered conversations became the hidden languages of resistance and resilience. In this way, obedience was sometimes a shield rather than a shackle. Yet the pressure to conform weighed heavily. The constant need to measure words and actions, the fear of missteps, and the knowledge that a single error could lead to ruin created psychological strain. Over time, many inhabitants experienced anxiety, distrust, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The unspoken rule was a double-edged sword. It offered protection through order, but also demanded the suppression of individual freedom and expression. For outsiders and newcomers, understanding this rule was essential to survival. Foreigners unfamiliar with the strict social codes quickly learned that any display of independence or ignorance could provoke hostility or punishment. Their experiences underscored the power of obedience as the invisible law that governed life in the castle town. The unspoken rule of survival through obedience was a reflection of the broader political realities of feudal Japan. In a world marked by conflict, power struggles, and shifting alliances, the ability of the Lord to command absolute loyalty was a cornerstone of stability. Without this rule, the delicate equilibrium of the castle town could easily unravel, leading to chaos and violence. Yet beneath the surface of obedience lay the complexities of human nature, hopes, fears, dreams, and doubts. While many outwardly conformed, their inner lives were filled with questions and desires that could never be openly expressed. The tension between outward obedience and inward individuality was a silent drama played out daily behind the castle walls. In the end, the unspoken rule of obedience was not just about survival. It was about the cost of survival. To live in the castle town meant accepting limitations, sacrificing freedoms, and navigating a world where power was absolute and mercy was scarce. It was a harsh reality that shaped generations, leaving a legacy of discipline, resilience, and quiet endurance. Thank you for joining me on this deep journey inside the hidden world of a Japanese castle town, where every day was a delicate dance of survival through obedience. Behind the towering walls and strict rules, lives were shaped by unspoken demands: to bow, to obey, and to never question. This was a place where power was absolute, freedom was limited, and the price of defiance was often deadly. If you found this exploration insightful and thought-provoking, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more immersive history stories told in a calm and engaging way. Your support means the world and helps keep these forgotten stories alive. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And if you want, share your thoughts or questions in the comments below. I love hearing from you and discussing these fascinating chapters of the past. Thanks again for watching. Stay curious, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next story.